Have you ever felt like your choices are your own? I mean, of course you have. But what if I told you there's a philosophical puzzle centuries old that suggests every single choice you've ever made and ever will make might not be as free as you think? Okay, let's dive into this deep, fascinating, and kind of mind-bending question.
So let's make this really personal. Just think about lunch tomorrow. Do you have any idea what you're going to eat? Maybe, maybe not. But here's the thing. If an all-knowing, omniscient God exists, he already knows. He knows right now if you're going to go for that salad or if you're going to grab a burger. So, when you actually make that choice tomorrow, were you ever really free to pick something else? Or were you just an actor playing out a scene in a script that was already written?
You see, this whole thing creates a crazy domino effect. It all starts with one core idea. God is omniscient. He knows everything. That means he knows the future, including every move you're going to make. But if your actions are already known, they kind of feel fixed, right? And that's a huge problem for the idea of free will. And here's the real kicker. If we aren't truly free, how can an all-loving or omnibenevolent God possibly judge us for what we do? Suddenly, the entire foundation of divine justice starts to look a little shaky. All right, so here's our game plan to unpack this massive puzzle. First, we'll look at where this whole problem came from. Then we're going to explore the most famous solution, this wild idea of a God who exists totally outside of time. After that, we'll look at the big critique that says no way, that's impossible. Then we'll check out a totally different alternative, a God who's right here in time with us. And finally, we'll see where this epic debate stands today. Okay, so let's get into it. This problem isn't new, not at all. We're talking about the philosopher Boethius, way back in the 6th century. He was one of the first thinkers to really get his hands dirty, wrestling with this clash between God knowing the future and humans having freedom. He knew he had to figure this out to defend the very idea of a God who is both just and loving. And seriously, this isn't just some late-night dorm room question. This is a profound, deep challenge that fills dense academic books. It strikes right at the heart of how we understand God, free will, and even morality itself. The stakes here are just incredibly high. So the first major attempt to solve this puzzle requires us to, well, basically flip our whole understanding of reality on its head. What if the problem isn't with God's knowledge, but with our tiny little human understanding of time? This is what's known as the eternal view. So Boethius came up with this truly mind-bending idea. He said, God isn't on our timeline waiting for the future to roll in. Nope, he's outside of time altogether. For God, there's no such thing as past or future. There's only one single, eternal present. This means God doesn't have foreknowledge of what you'll do. He's not predicting it. He's just seeing it. Your entire life, past, present, and future, all at once.
But you might be thinking, hang on, if he sees me do it, then it's fixed. It has to happen. To get around that, Boethius made this absolutely brilliant distinction. First, he defined what he called simple necessity. This is the really obvious, unavoidable stuff. A triangle has to have 3 sides. The sun has to rise. These things are necessary, no matter what anyone chooses. But then he introduced conditional necessity. And this is where it gets really, really clever. This type of necessity only happens because a free choice was already made. It's totally dependent on a condition, that condition being your choice. Think about it like this. If you look out your window right now and see someone walking down the street, is it necessary that they're walking? Well, yeah, of course it is. You can see it with your own eyes. But that necessity is conditional. It only exists because that person freely chose to get up and go for a walk. For Boethius, God sees our future choices in his eternal present in the exact same way. Our choices become necessary only because he sees us freely making them. Okay, so Boethius lays that incredible groundwork. Then, a few centuries later, another philosopher, Anselm, comes along. He takes this idea of a timeless God and just pushes it into an even more mind-bending space. He develops what we now call a four-dimensionalist approach. To really get this, let's do a quick dimension check. You start with a 1D line. You give it width, and boom, you've got a 2D plane, like a piece of paper. You give that plane depth, and you get a 3D cube. Well, four-dimensionalism says there's a next step. Our entire 3D world is moving through a 4th dimension, which we experience as time. So Anselm argued that just like a single moment in our time contains all of three-dimensional space, God's eternity is like a fifth dimension that contains our entire four-dimensional timeline within it. Our past, present, and future don't just unfold for God, they all exist right now, together, within God's eternal present. It's a staggering idea.
I mean, that is an elegant and powerful solution, right? But it's not perfect, not by a long shot. A huge challenge came from a 20th century philosopher named Anthony Kenny, who basically argued the whole idea just, well, it doesn't make any sense. Kenny's criticism was, let's say, blunt. He called this whole notion of a timeless, eternal God who sees everything at once radically incoherent. He basically felt it created a logical mess that was completely impossible to clean up. So here's Kenny's big problem with it. For a timeless God, the Great Fire of Rome back in 64 AD is happening at the exact same time as you watching this explainer right now. And Kenny just says, that's absurd. One event clearly, undeniably happened before the other. To say they're simultaneous seems to completely destroy the very idea of time and cause and effect. But Anselm's framework actually has a pretty clever defense built right in. He would say we need to distinguish between two different kinds of at the same time. You have temporal simultaneity, that's two things happening at the same moment within our timeline. But then you have eternal simultaneity, that's all the moments in our timeline existing together within God's higher dimensional eternity. So the Fire of Rome and you are not temporally simultaneous, but they are eternally simultaneous. It's a slick comeback. Okay, so if the whole God outside of time model seems way too complicated or even contradictory, what's the alternative? Well, some philosophers, like Richard Swinburne, came up with a completely different model, the everlasting view, which puts God right here with us, inside the flow of time. This view imagines a God who is everlasting, not eternal. What that means is he exists within time, just like we do. He knows the past and the present with perfect clarity, but the future is still open. God knows every possible choice you could ever make, but he doesn't know the definite one you will make until you make it. By basically sacrificing God's perfect foreknowledge of our choices, this model saves our free will, plain and simple. And wow, this leads to a radically different idea of a personal God. With an eternal God, praying is kind of about aligning yourself with a plan that's already set in stone. But with an everlasting God, prayer is a real-time, two-way conversation with a being who can actually respond to new events as they happen. But this solution has a big theological price tag. For a lot of people, a God who doesn't know the future isn't truly omniscient. It seems to limit God's power, making him less of a sovereign ruler and more of a really, really smart spectator. So yeah, this view might save our free will, but the big question is, does it do that by shrinking God? So where does all of this leave us? Well, it leaves us with two profoundly different, competing visions of what it even means for God to be all-knowing. Each one has its own strengths, its own weaknesses, and believe me, this debate is far from over. So in the end, we're left with these two very different pictures. On one side, you've got the eternal God of Anselm, this unchanging observer, totally outside of time, who sees our whole story in a single glance. And on the other side, you've got the everlasting God of Swinburne, a responsive participant inside of time who experiences history right along with us. It's a choice between two different kinds of God, and frankly, two different kinds of universes. And that leaves us with one final, powerful question to just let simmer. Is God the timeless author of a book that, from his perspective, is already finished? Or is God a character in that story with us, responding, reacting, and discovering the next chapter right alongside his own creation? The answer you lean towards doesn't just define God. It defines the very nature of our own freedom.